Hey guys, a lot of people think the biggest obstacle to marriage is money time or a future mother in law. It's not. The real obstacle is usually the government because somewhere out there is always a law looking at your love story and saying, let's see how we're supposed to process this properly. And the first story is a perfect example of how love can stop, but paperwork absolutely cannot. 1. In France, you can legally marry someone who has already died, not in a symbolic sense, but in the full legal sense. If you can prove that the two of you genuinely planned to get married before your partner passed away, you are allowed to submit a request to the President of France to complete the marriage. What's interesting is that at this point, the government does not play the role of comforter. It plays the role of a file checking clerk. They don't ask if you're still grieving. They ask where the evidence is, where the wedding plans are, and where the witnesses are. Because in the eyes of the law, this is not a love story that transcends death. It's an interrupted process that needs to be properly closed. This law was originally created to honor couples where one partner died before they could marry, especially during wartime. It sounds very humane, and then it stayed all the way to today. The result is a wedding where one person stands at the registry desk and the other is fully present in a legal sense, just not in the usual way. And the phrase "till death do us part" is interpreted very practically here. Death is not the ending. It just means you showed up a little late to sign the papers. 2. Some laws are written to regulate social behavior, and some laws are written because a group of people once felt extremely anxious about intimacy. Connecticut is a textbook example of the second category. According to an old Puritan-style law, a husband was not allowed to kiss his wife on Sunday. Not in public, not excessively, just a kiss on Sunday. The other 6 days were mostly fine, but on this one day, the law politely suggested distance. The logic was very clear. Sunday was the Lord's day, and apparently the Lord did not want to witness any kissing inside your home, especially not a perfectly legal kiss between two properly married adults. What makes this funny is what the law does not try to regulate. It doesn't ban cheating. It doesn't ban domestic violence. It doesn't ban lying. It zooms in obsessively on one tiny detail as if someone thought if we control the Sunday kiss, everything else will sort itself out. No one gets arrested for this anymore, but the fact that the law existed tells us something important. There was a time when the state felt responsible for managing your romantic schedule down to the day of the week. 6 days for love, 1 day for organized silence. 3. If you've ever thought marriage is always a lifelong commitment, Iran would politely suggest you reread the fine print very carefully, especially the part about duration. In Iran, there's a form of marriage known as temporary marriage. Legally and religiously, it is still marriage. There is a contract. There are clear terms. There is just one small but very important difference. The length can range anywhere from 1 hour to 99 years. And yes, 1 hour still counts as long as it's written down. Instead of asking how long you want to be together, the system asks a more direct question. How long are we signing for everything as agreed on in advance? Time, rights, obligations, dowry. It feels like a very serious negotiation, except the end result is that two people become husband and wife for a pre-approved amount of time. When the time runs out, the marriage ends automatically. No divorce, no arguments, no paperwork. You just look at the contract and realize the relationship has officially expired. This is one of the few places where marriage is not treated as a promise for life. It's treated as a fixed-term agreement. And that level of honesty leaves outsiders unsure whether they should be shocked, amused, or quietly take notes. 4. There are long-distance relationships, and then there is Montana, where the government looks at long distance and says, go farther, we can still make this work. In Montana, you can get legally married without being physically present. Not one person is missing. Both of you. Instead, each person sends a proxy to stand in court on their behalf. The two representatives meet, sign the papers, and that's it. You're married even if you're on opposite sides of the planet. Legally, everything is perfectly valid. Emotionally, it feels like attending your own wedding by power of attorney. No exchanged glances, no holding hands, just two strangers meeting for the first time and immediately becoming witnesses to your marriage. This law was originally designed for military personnel who couldn't be present due to duty. That part makes sense. The result, however, is one of the strangest wedding formats in the United States, where love doesn't need to show up as long as the paperwork does. Montana doesn't ask if you're ready. They just ask whether your representative arrived on time. 5. In many places, changing your last name after marriage is a tradition. In Japan, it's a legal requirement. By law, married couples in Japan must share the same last name. There is no option for keeping separate surnames. There is no middle ground. The couple has to choose one, and in reality, in over 90% of cases, it's the wife who changes hers. What's interesting is how little the law explains itself. It quietly implies that marriage is the moment two individuals become a single administrative unit, and every administrative unit should really have just one name to keep the paperwork tidy. Procedurally, this makes life easier for the state. In real life, it creates some very specific situations. Careers, degrees, official records, public identity. All of it may need to be updated simply because you decided to love and marry another person. Here, marriage isn't just an emotional commitment, it's a personal branding decision. You're not only choosing who you'll spend your life with, you're also choosing the name that will follow you on every form for the rest of it. And this law is still in effect, calm, serious, almost as if merging two human beings should obviously begin with merging their last names. 6. Everyone knows relationships that break up and get back together, then break up again, then somehow get back together again. Kentucky looks at that cycle and says, okay, 3 times is the emotional limit. The fourth time, we're not signing. In Kentucky, you're allowed to marry and divorce the same person up to 3 times. No questions asked, no intervention. But when you show up for the fourth attempt, the system stops. The application is denied, not because of marriage law, but because of something closer to collective self-respect. Legally speaking, the state seems to believe that if you've married the same person 3 times and still come back the fourth time is no longer love. It's a habit, and the government would rather not enable that habit. This is one of the rare moments where the state steps in as the most clear-headed friend in the room, the one who's watched the entire story unfold and finally says, no, this time we're taking away your car keys. Kentucky doesn't ban you from loving your ex again. It just bans you from signing the paperwork one more time. And in doing so, it becomes the only place that officially puts a limit on starting over. 7. In many places, who you marry is a private matter. In Saudi Arabia, who you marry can require an audit. If a Saudi citizen wants to marry a foreigner, love alone isn't enough. They need documents. A lot of documents. Age has to fall within an approved range. If they're divorced, they must wait a required amount of time. They also need official certification from local authorities confirming they don't carry certain listed hereditary diseases. The entire process makes marriage look less like a romantic decision and more like a formal job application, except that the position you're applying for is a legally recognized spouse. What stands out is what no one asks. There are no questions about emotional compatibility. No one checks if the two of you actually work well together. The focus is entirely on whether you meet the administrative criteria. Love can be powerful, but it still has to wait its turn in line. Here, marriage isn't just a personal choice. It's a state-approved project, and if you pass every checkpoint, you don't just walk away with a spouse. You walk away with the feeling that you've passed a very difficult exam just to be allowed to love the right person. 8. There were times when the law tried to solve society's biggest problems. And then there was New Jersey before 1972, where the state decided the most urgent issue in marriage was attitude. Under an old statute, women could be prosecuted if they were considered to be nagging their husbands. Not violence, not deception, just talking too much, talking too long, talking at the wrong time, talking in a way that made someone uncomfortable. What makes this remarkable is how serious the law sounded. It was called common scold, which feels like a carefully crafted legal term. In reality, it gave the state the authority to decide whether a wife was essentially talking too much. There were no clear measurements, no number of words, no volume limit. Just a general sense that if your speech disrupted household peace, you might be breaking the law. This is one of the rare moments where the government didn't just regulate marriage, it tried to regulate tone. Thankfully, the law was repealed. But the fact that it existed at all shows there was once a time when silence was treated as a legal obligation for women. 9. If you think marriage laws are usually vague, Utah will surprise you with its incredible level of specificity. In Utah, first cousins are allowed to marry, but only if both are over 65, or in certain cases over 55 with a court confirming infertility. This creates a very particular kind of logic. The state doesn't say the relationship is right or wrong, it just looks at the biological clock and says, wait a bit longer until all the potential risks have conveniently resolved themselves. In some ways, this is one of the most honest laws on the list. It doesn't lecture, it doesn't moralize. It quietly sets an age threshold and admits that after a certain point, the government stops worrying about long-term consequences. Utah doesn't ban it, Utah postpones it. And in doing so, it turns your family tree into something with a scheduled appointment. Love is allowed. Marriage just has to wait, for quite a while. 10. In many places, getting married is a decision between two people. In India, if you choose a civil marriage, it becomes a matter for the entire neighborhood. By law, couples must publicly post their intent to marry for 30 days before a civil wedding. The goal sounds reasonable: transparency, fraud prevention. The side effect is that anyone who sees the notice is allowed to object, and anyone doesn't have to be directly involved. It could be a neighbor, an old acquaintance, or someone who simply feels their opinion deserves to be heard. The state doesn't ask whether they love you, it asks whether they have a legal reason to object. And suddenly your wedding plans turn into a public comment period. In theory, this protects legitimate marriages. In practice, it creates a strange situation where one of the most personal decisions of your life has to wait 30 days just to see if someone nearby feels strongly against it. Here, marriage doesn't just require consent, it also requires collective silence. 11. If you've ever heard the phrase, once you're married, there's no going back, the Philippines decided to turn that into national policy. The Philippines is one of the very few places in the world with no true divorce system. Once you're married, you can't simply sign papers to end it. The closest option is annulment, a long, expensive process that requires proving the marriage was invalid from the very beginning. In other words, you're not allowed to say we no longer work. You have to say we should never have worked at all. This turns every breakup into a legal essay about the past. You're not just ending a relationship, you're rewriting its entire history to show it was never legitimate. Religiously and culturally, this law is meant to protect family values. In real life, it creates something very clear. This isn't a lifelong commitment in the romantic sense. It's a lifelong commitment in the administrative sense. In the Philippines, till death do us part isn't a vow. It's an accurate description of the process. 12. Some people are extremely careful about marriage. And then there's Kansas, where you can get married without realizing you just did. Kansas recognizes what's called a common law marriage. It sounds gentle, almost friendly, but the meaning is pretty direct. If two people live together, present themselves as husband and wife, and behave like a married couple, long enough, the law can look at that and say, all right, no ceremony needed, you're done here. No marriage license, no rings, no officiant. All it takes is enough people around you believing you're a couple. Your Facebook status doesn't even need to change. But if the neighbors start referring to you as that married couple, legally speaking, you might want to start paying attention. The interesting part is that many people only discover they're married when they try to break up. That's when Kansas calmly informs them, sorry, this isn't a breakup. This is a divorce. Elsewhere, getting married requires a lot of deliberate decisions. In Kansas, the biggest decision might just be how you introduce yourselves to the delivery guy. 13. Some laws are born out of morality. Some are born out of social order. And then there's Minnesota, where someone once decided the real problem in marriage was breath. Under an old law, if a husband's breath smelled strongly of garlic onions or sardines, he was not allowed to be intimate with his wife. Not advice. Law. Written down with full seriousness. The law doesn't mention emotions. It doesn't mention consent. It focuses on one very specific variable. Smell, as if marital happiness could be protected by closely monitoring what you ate for dinner last night. It's unclear who was supposed to measure the smell. It's unclear where the violation threshold was. All we know is that at some point the state officially took the side of the wife's nose. No one enforces this anymore. But the fact that it once existed suggests there was a time when lawmakers genuinely believed the strength of a marriage depended heavily on whether you ordered extra garlic. 14. In many places, getting married is a private affair. In Monaco, it's something you're encouraged to announce publicly first, just in case someone wants to intervene. In Monaco, before you can get married, you have to publicly post your intention to do so for a set period of time. That sounds reasonable. The issue is that during that window, the authorities are free to step in and say, hold on, we have a few questions. The idea is to protect social order, prevent fraud, coercion, or legal complications. The result is that your wedding doesn't just require love and planning, it also requires that no one objects strongly enough. In Monaco, the biggest threat to your wedding isn't an ex showing up at the last minute. It's an administrative office, and I feel slightly uncomfortable. The government doesn't tell you not to love each other. It just reserves the right to ask very detailed questions before letting you sign. And so your relationship has to pass a quiet but serious test. The kind that suggests if your love is strong enough, it should survive being posted on a public notice board. 15. If you've ever worried about choosing the right person to officiate your wedding, Nevada would like to relax you in a very specific way. In Nevada, if your wedding ceremony is performed by someone pretending to be a minister or a judge, the marriage is still legally valid with one condition. At least one of you genuinely believed that person had the authority to do it. In other words, The law doesn't ask who the officiant actually was. It asks whether you believed in them. And if the answer is yes, congratulations, you're legally married. This makes Nevada one of the rare places where personal belief carries real legal weight. If you truly thought the person in the robe was legitimate, the state is not going to argue with your faith. The law was designed to protect couples from technical mistakes made in good faith. The result, however, is a system where a fake Elvis, if believed strongly enough, can permanently change your marital status. In Nevada, love needs paperwork, but belief matters just as much. And sometimes, as long as you believe in the right person, the law is happy to follow along. 16. Some places treat divorce as a difficult decision. China treats it as a decision that needs to be rescheduled. By law, if a couple files for a mutual divorce, they must wait 30 days for a mandatory cooling off period. During that time, the state assumes the two of you might calm down, change your minds, or at the very least become too tired to come back and finish the process. And here's the important part. After those 30 days, if both people don't show up again to confirm, the divorce application is automatically canceled. No reminder, no follow-up email. You don't come back? The system simply assumes everything is fine. This turns breaking up into a test of endurance. It's not just about whether you still want a divorce. It's about whether you're persistent enough to want it on the correct administrative date. In theory, the law is meant to prevent impulsive decisions. In practice, it makes divorce feel like an application that quietly disappears if you forget to click confirm. Your relationship may already be over. But if the paperwork isn't finalized on time, the state will politely assume it's still salvageable. 17. In many places, if a marriage has serious issues, annulment is an option. Tennessee has a very specific perspective on that idea. Here, if you marry someone who has been legally declared mentally incompetent, the law looks at one detail only. Did you know this before the wedding? If you didn't know, the marriage can be annulled. Fair enough, but if you knew, went ahead anyway, and later changed your mind, Tennessee looks at you and says, no, you knew what you were doing. In other words, the law doesn't protect you from a bad decision. It only protects you from a bad decision you made without information. If you had full knowledge and still proceeded, that's no longer a mistake. That's a choice. This is one of the rare cases where the law refuses to offer an exit simply because you were too informed. Tennessee doesn't judge your love. It just gently reminds you that if you sign the papers with full awareness, you're expected to live with them. Here, there's no annulment for regret, only annulment for ignorance. Everything else comes with a quiet invitation to move forward with the decision you already made. 18. In many places, getting married is about choosing a date and a venue. In Israel, the first thing you have to choose is a country. Israel does not have a fully implemented civil marriage system inside the country, which means if you don't want to or can't get married through a religious authority, the state offers a very polite workaround. You can get married abroad, bring the paperwork back, and it will be recognized. Technically, this is completely legal. Emotionally, it feels like being told we don't sell this item here, but if you buy it somewhere else, feel free to bring it home. The result is that many Israeli couples turn their weddings into short trips. Not for romance. For administration. They get married in Cyprus, Prague, or anywhere that will let them sign the papers, then return home as if nothing unusual happened. Here, love isn't forbidden. It just has to be stamped at a different airport, and the state maintains a calm, consistent position. It's not that we won't let you get married, we just won't do it here. 19. If you think marriage laws are usually vague, New York will surprise you with a very precise exception. In New York, marrying your niece or nephew is illegal. That sounds clear enough, until the law adds a small detail. If you're only a half-sibling to that person's parent, then legally the relationship does not fall under the prohibited category. This is the moment where the law decides to break family ties on technical levels, not emotional closeness, genetic diagrams. The state doesn't offer a moral opinion. It simply draws a legal boundary using terminology, then stops. The rest is left to society, awkward eye contact, and silence. What confuses people isn't what the law allows. It's how detailed the law is willing to get. As if someone sat for a very long time with a pen and a family tree and said, this part is not allowed. This part is technically allowed. New York doesn't encourage anything. It just classifies, and sometimes classification itself is the most unsettling part. 20. In many places, when a marriage ends, it's called a divorce. In Vatican City, that concept simply does not exist. Here, you cannot get divorced. Legally, there is no end button. The only thing you can apply for is a declaration that the marriage was never valid to begin with, meaning the state doesn't say you were married and now you're separating. It says after careful review, we've concluded that technically this never happened. This turns every breakup into a retroactive investigation. You're not allowed to say we've changed. You have to prove that from the moment you stood at the registry desk, there was a fundamental flaw that made the marriage unqualified to exist. The Vatican doesn't recognize fading feelings. It only recognizes procedural errors, serious misunderstandings, or conditions that failed to meet you with the original definition of marriage. Here, marriage has no sequel, only a prequel under review. And if approved, you're not someone who got divorced. You're someone who was just informed that apparently you were never married at all. 21. Some laws are confusing. And then some laws force you to pause for a long time before you even know what to say next. In Somalia, the legal age for marriage is 18. But attached to that is a deeply troubling exception. A girl as young as 10 can be allowed to marry if she is considered to have reached puberty and gives consent. On paper, this appears as a legal provision. In reality, it places an enormous burden on a very vague idea. Who decides? By what standard? And most importantly, who is actually protecting the child's interests? This is not humorous in the usual sense, but it still belongs on a list of the world's most shocking marriage laws because it exposes a huge gap between legal language and lived reality. Here, the state does not ask whether a child is ready for marriage. The law simply assumes that a biological marker can replace maturity, choice, and protection. And it's the calm, neutral tone of the legal wording that makes it the most unsettling part. 22. Some laws are written to prohibit. And then there's Mississippi, where the anti-polygamy law reads like the author just sat through a very long sermon and is still angry about it. This law doesn't just say polygamy is illegal, it explains in great detail why, in a tone that is anything but neutral. The language is emotional, condemnatory, and carries the energy of someone who is exhausted from having to repeat the same point over and over again. Instead of listing clean legal clauses, the text takes time to describe living with multiple partners as immoral, offensive to public decency, and deeply harmful to social order. When you finish reading it, you don't just know it's banned. You know the writer really didn't like this idea. Laws usually try to sound detached. This one doesn't. It doesn't just regulate behavior, it wants you to feel the disappointment. Mississippi doesn't simply say no, it says no, and we are very unhappy about this. And in doing so, the law becomes a sermon with an official seal. 23. There are decisions in life that you wish came with an undo button. Delaware looks directly at that reality and says, if you got married on a bet or as a joke, we'll give you a way out. In Delaware, if you can prove that a marriage happened purely as a prank, a dare, or a clearly unserious decision, you can apply for an annulment almost immediately. No waiting period, no long arguments, just proof that this was a bad idea from the start. This turns marriage law into a surprisingly forgiving friend, the kind that says, okay, everyone makes a stupid decision sometimes. We'll let this one go. The rule doesn't apply to marriages that fail later. It's reserved for cases where right after signing the papers, you already started thinking, what did I just do? In Delaware, marriage is taken seriously, but if you entered it as a joke, the state is willing to agree with you and quietly erase it before the story becomes too long to fix. 24. In many places, naming your child is the parent's first creative moment. In Denmark, it's the moment you're advised to check the list first. Here, you can't just name your child whatever you want. The government maintains an approved list of names. Choose from it and everything goes smoothly. If you want to be creative, you'll need to apply, along with a reasonable explanation for why this name deserves to exist. The idea sounds tidy. Protect children from truly bizarre names. The side effect is that naming your child can start to feel like pitching a proposal. You're not just saying this is my child's name. You're quietly arguing that the name is worthy of approval. In Denmark, your child isn't even born yet, but an administrative file is already waiting, and their identity needs to be signed off on by people who have never met them. This is a place where parental love is strong. But the final authority over what your child is called lives inside an official database updated regularly, taken very seriously. 25. In most places, when a marriage falls apart because of an affair, the story ends between the two spouses. North Carolina looks at the third person and says, hold on, we'd like to talk to you. In this state, you can sue the person your spouse cheated with on the grounds that they alienated affection from your marriage. This isn't a private matter. It's a civil lawsuit, with paperwork, damages, and a dollar amount attached to heartbreak. This turns the third party into an official character in a family tragedy, not just disliked, legally summoned. The law assumes that love inside a marriage is a kind of property, and if someone takes it, they can be held financially responsible. In North Carolina, you don't just get hurt, You can calculate the damage and bring it to court where emotions become evidence and betrayal gets converted into compensation. This is one of the few places where a love triangle doesn't end in silence. It ends in a verdict. 26. There were times when people feared war disease and famine. And then there was England in the past, where the greatest threat to marriage was a makeup bag. Under an old law, if a woman used perfume cosmetics, false hair, false teeth, or high heeled shoes to deceive a man into marriage, the marriage could be annulled. Worse than that, she could be tried under witchcraft laws. The logic was simple. If a man married you because you looked different from your natural state that wasn't love, that was sorcery. The law treated makeup not as beauty, but as intentional visual fraud, a form of premarital deception, and the state felt obligated to protect men from dangerous lipstick. What's especially telling is that the law never asks why the man didn't notice. It focuses entirely on what you did to your face before the wedding. At the time, marriage wasn't just an emotional commitment. It was a test of whether you could maintain the appearance you had advertised. And if you failed, congratulations. You hadn't just tricked a man, you had done it with magic. 27. In many places, marriage is about love. In South Africa, it's also a very serious financial decision whether you thought about it or not. By default, if you get married without signing a prenuptial agreement, all assets and all debts are automatically merged. Income property, student loans, unpaid credit cards, everything becomes shared. The law doesn't ask if you're ready. It simply assumes that once you're married, everything should be shared, including past financial mistakes you personally had nothing to do with. This makes marriage in South Africa feel like hitting the merge button on two bank accounts. No preview, no warning, just a sudden moment of realization that your partner's debt is now also your debt. So here, love alone isn't enough. You have to love someone enough to accept their spending history. Because if you don't sign the papers in advance, the state is more than happy to sign for you. 28. In many places, getting married is about choosing a good date. In Lebanon, the first thing you have to choose is the right nationality setup. Lebanon does not have a unified civil marriage system within the country, which means if two people are from different religions or simply don't want a religious marriage, the state offers a polite alternative. You can get married abroad, bring the documents back, and it will be recognized. Procedurally, this is perfectly valid. Experientially, it feels like being told the system doesn't support your request. Please try again in another country. As a result, many Lebanese couples turn their weddings into short international trips. Not for romance, for paperwork. They get married somewhere else, then return home with a stamped document and no further questions asked. Here, love isn't forbidden. It just doesn't have the right service counter. And once you come back with foreign paperwork, the state nods quickly as if the problem was never the marriage, just the location of the stamp. 29. Some places ask if you love each other enough to get married. Truro, Massachusetts once asked a different question. Can you hunt birds under an old local law? Before getting married, a man had to prove his ability to provide by going hunting. Specifically, he had to kill 6 blackbirds or 3 crows. Not symbolically, not ceremonially. Actual birds. The logic was simple. If you can't bring food home, you might not be ready for marriage. And the fastest way to test that was to send you outside with a weapon and a checklist. This turned marriage into a side quest in a survival game. Love was not enough. You needed achievements. No one enforces this anymore. But the fact that it existed shows there was a time when marriage didn't begin with vows. It began with a very practical question. What did you hunt today? And if the answer was nothing, the wedding probably needed to wait. 30. In many places, adultery leads to divorce. In medieval England, cheating with the wrong person could lead to treason. Under royal law, if a commoner slept with the king's wife, the king's unmarried daughter, or the wife of the heir to the throne, it was considered treason. Not because of love, but because it threatened the royal bloodline. Here, the problem wasn't emotional betrayal. It was the possibility of confusing succession. A private affair suddenly became a national security issue. The law didn't care who you loved. It cared whether you interfered with the system of inheritance. And if you did, the consequences were treated as extreme. Today, the punishments have changed, but the law still exists as a very clear reminder. In the royal family, love was never just personal. It was political, and choosing the wrong person to cheat with was once a decision with historic consequences.